and start from here.
Right, good morning and welcome to those of you who've joined us for Our World Reimagined session this morning. My name's Susie Scott and I work for GCBS, and it's my role this morning to introduce this session with Toby Lowe from Newcastle University, who will be expertly interviewed by our resident broadcaster, Pennie Taylor. Without more ado, I'm going to hand over to Pennie to take charge of the proceedings for the rest of this hour.
Thank you so much, and welcome to everybody who's joining this important conversation. I think this is number 8 in the Our World Reimagined Big Ideas series. We've been hearing some fantastic contributions to the thinking about where we go from here in Scotland. And our next speaker is hotly awaited. Now, before we speak to or hear from Toby Lowe, I wonder whether I can just take us through the Zoom process. If you have a look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you will see a Q&A icon. That's for putting your questions to the speaker, because we have plenty of time for chat after Toby Lowe has spoken and asking your questions. You can ask a question anonymously there, and you can also what they call up-like a question that you would like to ask that somebody else has already asked that pushes it up the list. So please make most use of that. I see a few folk are already on the chat function, which is for us to share any comments, to share any links, that kind of thing. So, without further ado, I would very much like to introduce Professor Toby Lowe of Newcastle Business School and Centre for Public Impact. He's going to be talking about doing public management differently with specific reference to human learning systems. But before you get stuck into what you want to say, Toby, I wonder if I can ask you, what brought you personally through your career to this point now, engaging with these bright ideas?
Thanks, Pennie. So all the things that I'm going to be talking to you about today essentially came from me being a voluntary sector chief executive. So I worked for 15 years across the public and voluntary sector in the UK. Most recently as the chief executive of a kind of medium scale arts charity in the northeast of England, and it was in that role gave me a deep and abiding frustration of the funding and performance management mechanisms that voluntary sector organisations are asked to work within, and I just thought we must be able to do it better than this. Hence switching to a business school and most latterly CPI as a vehicle to see if we can change any of this stuff.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that context. And it's wonderful to know that you straddle both these worlds. So you're bringing your personal experience of being a charity chief executive to this discussion. So to everybody attending, please put your questions for Toby in the Q&A section, and take it away, Professor Toby Lowe.
Thanks very much, Pennie. Yes, as I said before, being an academic is still a bit of an unsettling recategorisation for me, so it still sounds a bit odd to me. I should say, by the way, that my home institution is Northumbria University, so Newcastle Business School is at Northumbria University, before my colleagues get very upset. But it's an exceptionally confusing arrangement with 2 universities in Newcastle. So yes, I'm a visiting professor of public management at the Centre for Public Impact. And I am my home institution. I'm being lent to CPI from Newcastle Business School at Northumbria University. I'm going to give you a brief presentation now. If all goes according to plan, should be about 18 minutes, we think. So, I need to share the screen. Where are we? Share screen. So, Look at that, nearly as slick as you like. Can everyone see a big green screen saying doing public management differently? Brilliant, thank you very much, Lynn. So the big idea I want to talk to you about is doing public management differently. Now, admittedly, that doesn't sound like a very interesting idea, but I promise you I'm going to try and make it less boring than it sounds. I'm going to talk to you about what the current dominant paradigm is for public management, and name it. It's called New Public Management. And then I'm going to try and explain why complexity is relevant to doing public management differently. Talk to you a bit about this alternative approach, the human learning systems approach, and I'm going to finish up with an example of what this looks like in practice to hopefully make it more, bring it alive for people. So. Essentially, our big idea is simple in that we can choose to fund and manage social interventions in a different way. And just the way that we choose to do these things, to fund and manage social interventions, is called public management. So public management is a discipline that managers and leaders across public and voluntary sector practice. It's essentially what you all do. But it's got, in academic terms, it is a discipline called public management. And currently there is a dominant paradigm, a dominant way of doing things in public management, and it's called New Public Management. It's not actually very new. It arose in the kind of 1980s. And colloquially, it's known as the 3 M's: markets, managers, and metrics. And so what that means is that, firstly, metrics, it says that all social objectives, so all the things that we're trying to do, should be measurable. So they should be, all the complex social change that we're trying to create should be capable of being turned into quantifiable objectives. And secondly, managers, that we create a class of workers whose job it is to test whether those desired metrics are being achieved or not. And punish and reward people according to whether those things are happening. And finally, markets, the idea that the best way to achieve value for money in meeting these desired objectives is to get organizations to compete to deliver this desired metric data for the cheapest possible price. In some respects, a kind of bit of an oversimplification, but I think you will probably recognize elements of all of that in the work that you've been doing. So this is the dominant way that we do things at the moment. It's called New Public Management. The only problem with that is that New Public Management doesn't work in complex environments. Pretty much all the evidence says this. Lots and lots of research been done about it. Pretty much all says the same thing. In complex environments, New Public Management creates gaming, so turns everyone's job into the production of good-looking data, creates perverse incentives, incentivizes people to actually do the wrong thing, generally makes the job of public and voluntary service harder. Neatly summed up in 2016 by Sir Peter Housden, ex-head of the civil service in Scotland. He wrote a pamphlet called Rethinking Public Service, and in it he described the unconscionably long death of New Public Management. We know this stuff doesn't work, so why are we still doing it? So this is what I want to say. We have a choice about how we do public management. But the key to understanding that choice is to say, okay, what does the alternative look like? And so this is the question that I've been working on, first at the business school and secondly at the Centre for Public Impact for the last kind of 5.5, 6 years. And we think understanding what the alternative looks like starts by embracing the complexity of the real world. What do I mean by that? So why is complexity relevant? Because our starting assertion is that complexity is important because it describes the fundamental processes by which the outcomes we care about are made. So if we don't understand and embrace complexity, we won't be able to create the outcomes that we seek. So if we care about outcomes, and we do, then we need to understand the complexity of the way that those outcomes are made in real life. So let me try and make that idea a bit more tangible. Some people may be familiar with this. It's the Systems Map of Obesity. So it's what happens when you shut a bunch of public health experts in a room and say, you're not allowed out until you map all the causes of obesity and all the relationship between all of those causes. 108 different factors these folk identified for the causes of obesity, and you can see the relationship between all of those causes on this systems diagram. And what this diagram beautifully illustrates is that an outcome like obesity, and this is true for any outcome, it's just that the work has been done for obesity, an outcome is the product of all of these factors working together. So you can't see all the individual factors on this map, it's too small, but you can see them summed up into things like early life experiences, food production and supply, macroeconomic drivers, education, media, technology, the nature of work, built environment. And just right down in the bottom right-hand corner of this system, you see healthcare and treatment options. So those 4 factors out of 108 are the services that would be commissioned or funded to address the outcome of obesity. They're 4 factors out of 108. So what we see is that an outcome is produced by all of these factors interacting together. It's only marginally influenced by the things that are funded or commissioned to address an outcome. This is why, if we care about outcomes, we need to understand the complex reality of life. So, what are the implications for performance management? And the single most important implication of all of this, and this is, if you take one thing away from today, I would like you to be this idea: outcomes are not delivered by organizations. You can tell I think this is an important idea because I've written it in big red shouty capital letters. Outcomes are not delivered by organizations. They're just not. That's not how the world works. The outcomes we desire are emergent properties of complex systems. Pretending that outcomes are delivered by organization is exactly the mess that we've got ourselves into in new public management, with new public management, right? So, well, how then do we respond to this idea that outcomes are the product of complex systems? This is essentially what we've been trying to explore for the last kind of 5 or 6 years. And the work that we've been doing with public and voluntary sector organisations throughout the UK and also some abroad as well, we've learned that an alternative looks like based on 3 key ideas: human learning systems. And I'm going to kind of dig into those very quickly with you now. So essentially, it revolves around 3 key changes. Firstly, a change in service purpose. So the purpose of public and voluntary service under a human learning systems approach is simply meeting human strengths and needs. That's it. Secondly, there's a change in management focus, saying that the focus of management is creating the conditions for learning and adaptation. That's what managers' jobs looks like under a human learning systems approach. And finally, it's a change in leadership focus, because we've seen that outcomes are produced by complex systems. The idea is that the role of leadership is to nurture the healthy systems which lead to positive outcomes more often than not. I'll dig into each of these 3 ideas in a bit more detail now. So firstly, human. So we couldn't spend more than kind of 10 minutes with any organisation working in this way before someone said something like, well, this is just about being more human to each other, isn't it? Like, oh, that's brilliant. Oh, that's a chapter heading, that is. Hang on a minute. What do you mean by being more human to each other? So we dug into that idea a little bit. And what they seem to mean is that to be human, we put on our vest. So that means responding to the variety of human needs and experience, because there are as many ways to be human as there are human beings. And if you want to create an outcome like well-being in my life, you need to understand that well-being for me is different than for Penny, than for Susie, than for Lynne. Like, we each experience outcomes differently. And so our service responses need to be able to understand that variety and diversity of human experience. Secondly, if we're going to do that, if we're going to respond to the variety of each and every person's life context, then we need empathy to understand the lives of others. So the organisations working this way puts so much value on building empathy between people. They also seem to view people from a strengths-based perspective. So rather than people being the bearers of problems of whatever it is that your service responds to, so people who work through it's really easy for services to view people as whatever problem they walk through the door that service can help with. So people become carriers of mental health problems or substance misuse, or if someone has experienced domestic violence. That's like people who work in this way saying, actually, that's not a helpful way to look at people. People are brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers. They like taking their dogs for walks on the beach, or they like football, and all of those things are likely to be relevant for the work you want to do with them. So people need to be seen in this kind of as fully rounded human beings. And finally, if we're going to do all of this, it means we need to trust people with decision making. Because essentially, if you're going to respond to the variety of each and every person's context, that means that there are only two sets of people who know enough to be able to say, okay, we should do this and not that. Those two sets of people are the person themselves being served and the worker who has a strong enough relationship with them to really deeply understand them. Only those people know enough to frame what the intervention, the work that should be done in their lives. No one else does. So we need to trust those people with that decision making. So to be human, variety, empathy, strength, and trust. So next, learning. Essentially what we're saying here is that in a complex environment, learning is required to be a continuous process, because the world as we know it, as a complex system, is constantly changing. In technical terms, it's dynamic, right? So for example, if you set your performance objectives this time last year, either as a manager setting them for your teams or as a person being set objectives by someone above you, you would probably put quite a lot of work into that this time last year. You might have done research, you might have assembled a bunch of evidence. What's the most important things for us to work on? If you did that this time last year, how many of those performance objectives were things that were useful for you to work on this year? How many of you saw COVID come in as the thing that you needed to really respond to? Not very many people, I would guess. That's because the world is complex and dynamic. It is constantly changing. And whether our interventions work or not depends on their relationship with this constantly changing environment. So that means that what works is the continuous process of learning and adaptation, because that's what enables our interventions to keep working. The moment we stop learning is the moment our interventions stop working. And so this has two strong implications for this way of doing public management. Firstly, what it is that funders and commissioners are purchasing is the capacity for organisations to learn and adapt. And secondly, that the primary job of managers is to create learning environments. So that's learning. And finally, systems. So our hypothesis here is that healthy systems produce better outcomes. So the first question then is, who's looking after the health of the system? If a healthy system is kind of simply one that in which the actors in that system, the people, the organisations, are able to coordinate and collaborate effectively. So who's asking for any given system, are the actors in it able to coordinate and collaborate effectively? And what should we do about that? And we call that role system stewardship. So this is what we're saying kind of focus for leadership is. So what we're describing here is a paradigm shift in kind of management approach from a control mindset. So the job of managers is to control their subordinates, to an enablement mindset. Because what we're talking about isn't just a different set of practices or tools, it's a completely different way of thinking and doing public management. And it's based on essentially finding and nurturing people's intrinsic motivation and then creating a system which makes that real. Implications of all of this for the way that we do management. Firstly, no targets, don't set targets. They prevent flexible, bespoke responses. They make work more expensive. They make work more siloed. All the research says that this is it's a silly thing to do in complex environments. Let's stop doing it, eh? Secondly, fund for learning, not outcomes or results. Again, all the evidence says in a complex environment, if you fund for outcomes or results, then what you get is a bunch of people whose job it is to produce good-looking data. You don't get actual improvement in real people's lives. Thirdly, that you need to build trust in a system. You can't assume trust. You need to work on your relationships and invest time in building trust relationships, working out what good reasons for trust are. Fourthly, learn together. So the method to achieve all this is co-production, experimentation, talking about what didn't work, creating rigorous learning environments. Fifth, everyone's voice is important because healthy systems require everyone's voice to be heard. So there's a bunch of work to do to make everyone's voice heard. Who's going to do that? And finally, if all this is going to work, it requires new forms of accountability and responsibility, particularly development of kind of mutual, horizontal, peer-to-peer accountability, and nurturing a sense of personal responsibility and duty amongst everyone doing the work. So all this can feel a bit theoretical. It's actually, all of this is built on our research on actual practice. So everything that I've told you about comes from us doing research alongside people who are actually working in this way. But to make it a bit more tangible, I just wanted to give you an example of what this looks like in practice. So giving you very briefly, talk you through what the Plymouth Alliance are doing. Plymouth Alliance are a combination of local authority, clinical commissioning group, so a local NHS in England, working and public and voluntary sector organisations working to support, in their language, it's not brilliant, but adults with complex needs in Plymouth. So people who've experienced homelessness, substance misuse, mental health problems, those kind of things. And what the local authority and the health service did in partnership with the voluntary sector is they created an £80 million 10-year shared budget to commission a health and care system, commissioning a system for vulnerable adults in Plymouth. Tendered through an alliance contract model whereby organisations came together in the city to create a shared response. And this is the crucial bit, right? The tender did not specify outputs or outcomes or processes to be delivered. Instead, it focused on collaboration and learning together. £80 million of public money commissioned on the basis of no KPIs, not a single KPI in that contract anywhere, and no targets. This is possible, even under existing procurement regulations, all of that stuff. If we want to do this, we can just choose to do it differently. And some of the things that they've been able to do, I kind of won't talk through all of this because I'm probably going over time, but I'll just focus on the last one. For example, they've halved their emergency accommodation budget for homeless families in the city, but essentially making housing officers, so the people responsible for housing allocation decisions and for evicting problem tenants, because they've been brought together in a pooled budget with the people who have to provide and pay for emergency accommodation for families. Previously, if they booted a family out of their home because they were causing trouble in their neighbourhood, someone else paid for the emergency accommodation support. So that's I will evict those people because that's someone else's problem then. By bringing that together into a single system, the housing officers were like, oh, that's my budget that I'm going to have to spend on emergency accommodation now. Maybe I won't evict that family. Maybe I'll try and find out what their underlying issues are, and maybe we can give them some tenancy support and stuff like that. Consequently, they've reduced their cost for emergency accommodation, for bed and breakfast, all that kind of stuff, from £1.1 million a year to £600,000 a year in 6 months. And what that all translates into is better service to those in need for lower costs. And you know, if you're a commissioner or a funder, that's quite appealing. So this is what a kind of very quick run through this as a way of doing public management differently. If you want to find out more, you can see it on the humanlearning.systems website. There's a bunch of case studies and material and all sorts of stuff. Maybe some questions that you might be interested in. So who's funding for learning in Scotland? What case studies exist already? And who wants to start to experiment with working in this way? And what would it take for you to start? Because finally, I will say there's no recipe for doing all this. There's a bunch of stuff that we've learned from different places, but every organization, every place that does this is essentially learning to do it for themselves. So the method to achieve it is to start your own experiments in doing this differently. Thanks very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Another really stimulated challenge here for the #OWR Big Ideas series. Toby, really fascinating. And before we move into the questions from delegates, I wonder if I can ask, what else needs to change? I mean, I heard you very powerfully there saying you can choose to do it differently. Can you really, in a system that wants to measure you by the existing measurements and may not be that interested in learning systems, what do you do about that?
So there's different answers to this question depending on who you are and where you are in the system. So commissioners can just choose to do this differently. I mean, frankly, it's a pain for them and requires a lot of extra work to make that change, which is sometimes why it's hard to do it. So I'm not going to pretend that any of this is easy,
No.
but it is simply a choice that commissioners can make to do things differently. So we've got now a whole number of examples from across the UK, mostly England, but frankly, if you can do it in England, you can do it anywhere, of commissioners choosing to do this stuff differently. So that is simply a choice that commissioners and kind of broad, like the folk around them, can do. For voluntary sector organisations, it is harder because they are dependent on the way that they're funded. But one of the things that they can do, voluntary sector organisations can do, is to ask those who fund them, charitable foundations, commissioners, why are you choosing to fund me like this? One of the things I've found is that actually turning the concept of accountability round can be a really useful conversation starter in all of this, because you can say to people, like, okay, I understand that you want to kind of fund me like this and to measure it like this. The evidence says that that's not a very effective thing to do, and like will cause all these kind of problems. And we're going to do some evaluation on this at the end. So would you mind signing off on this to say, because our evaluators will ask at some point why we were funded like this. Would you just mind signing off on the fact that you're choosing to do it like this? Ooh, let's use accountability to say to if people want to fund and commission in the old school way, let's make people accountable for making that choice.
Right, now I would really love to hear any questions from people working in organisations in Scotland in response to that. How easy or how possible would that be for you to do? But I'd like to pick up on a question that's come through, basically saying, what are your reflections before we go much further? Because you've mentioned England and we've had the example of, it was Plymouth, wasn't it? What's your perception of where Scotland stands? Are we maybe a bit more conservative about these things than they are south of the border?
So I know that there's a bunch of people having these kind of conversations in Scotland. So folk like the Robertson Trust have been engaged in some of these conversations, for example, with our kind of my partner organisation in this since the start is an organisation called Collaborate. There's they have a person based in Scotland called Annabelle Davidson Knight. She has been supporting a bunch of funders to and I think some local authorities, could be wrong about that, to have some of these conversations. There's another charitable foundation in Scotland who've been exploring these ideas, whose name has just gone out of my head.
We can share links, and circulate them in the future. So don't worry about that. And if anybody knows that, please post the link in the chat function, because that's a really useful place for people to pick up ideas. There's been a fantastic question coming from Pegs Bailey saying, I work in employability commissioning in a local authority in Scotland. We're moving towards a human learning systems approach, brackets, slowly, which is great to hear. I don't know what local authority that is, but a big issue we come up against is strategic decision makers, stroke leaders have a lot of fear around letting go of KPIs and targets. Any tips on how to move forward and support this journey?
Well, yeah, brilliant question. Because and I should caveat this when I say commissioners can choose. Actually, those commissioners are constrained by a bunch of organisations. So I was using commissioners as kind of shorthand for all the decision-making machinery around this. So that it's actually an important piece of nuance to put into all of this. So there's a couple of kind of nice tips that I've heard from organisations who are kind of making this kind of journey. The first one is that we should be kind to the people who are having to make this kind of change, because mostly they're not holding on to the things they're holding on to because they're bad people or like want to be obstructive or whatever. They are doing the best they can in difficult, in amazingly difficult circumstances right now. So this idea of being human to one another isn't just about kind of the service relationship. This is about a relationship between human beings in this kind of broader context. So having human to human conversations is a way to help people let go of fear, right? Acknowledging fear, talking through what people is scared of, and then connecting those people making strategic decisions to the complex reality of the lives of the people that they're supporting. So one of the things that Plymouth does, for example, is use a process of appreciative inquiry, which is a kind of a technique of a kind of story-based interviewing to capture the experiences of people throughout a system. So people being served, the different blah, blah, blah. And so they train people at all levels of their organization, including kind of local authority, to go and do like narrative story-based interviews with people. So they had a whole bunch of things where they trying to make some decisions about what to do with kind of parks and green spaces in the city. They trained a bunch of people in this appreciative inquiry, sent them out into the parks with just like kind of little pens and paper and like stopping people who were walking their dogs and like pushing prams and whatever. Do you mind if I ask you about your perfect day in the park? And just kind of and writing down their stories, right? And then what they do. And so the stories they hear are very varied. Like I bring my disabled son to the park because it's pretty much the only green space around here, and like it's amazing for him. He really loves getting out and blah, blah, blah. And oh yeah, and I have to do that because like I'm a shift worker and I come at this time of day because it's quiet. You know, you actually hear the full complexity of the lives of another human being. And so what they do is they take these stories that they get from people, turn them into I stories, so first person narratives. I am the father of a disabled son. I am blah, blah, blah. I come to the park because they write them onto little kind of cards and then they distribute them around the strategic decision-making meetings. And they just begin their meetings with each person around the table reading out one of these I stories. I am, so they literally put the stories of different human beings in the system in the mouths of people making decisions. And that means that those strategic decision makers connect with the complex reality of other human beings' lives. And it's once you've done that, it's much harder to insist on a key performance indicator.
I mean, it's fantastic to hear that stories are being shared, but I can't be the only one whose heart sinks a little bit. That at this stage in the 21st century, this appears to be such a hard message to get across. I mean, for at least, I've been covering this field for knocking on, well, it's certainly more than 30 years, and knocking on for 40 years. Why is it so slow?
So my diagnosis around this, and this is just my perspective, obviously, that it is because of the dominant public management paradigm we've been asked to work within. So what new public management does is it dehumanizes people because it essentially reduces people to single data points or tiny little clusters of data. And if you're making decisions about people on that kind of really thin, abstracted, pauperized version of their lives, people make terrible decisions about that stuff. But this is how we have trained entire generations of managers to think this is what management is. We should then not be surprised that they think that this is what management is. Now, business schools share their blame with all this, blah, 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 blah.
So they haven't been listening up until now. What's going to make them listen from here on in?
So, I mean, interestingly, one of the drivers for change that we've seen around this is austerity.
Yeah.
Because one of the weird side effects of new public management is that it's much more expensive. So new public management is so wasteful. Oh my God, it's wasteful because it focuses people's attention on doing the wrong things. And like I say, it makes terrible decisions because it reduces people to single data points. And as a result, we waste millions of pounds of public service and voluntary sector money because of new public management. And the drive for austerity, one of the weird side effects, you'd never want this because austerity kills people, but is people need radical solutions to get better for cheaper. And one of the things that you can do as a radical solution to get better for cheaper is to stop using new public management.
Yeah, okay. Now here's a question from Adam Dunkley, and I'm going to add on an observation from Simon Tucker into this. Adam Dunkley says, just following up from PEGS, the Plymouth model sounds very interesting and clearly beneficial outcomes from the way it was commissioned. Just wanted to check, were these the intended outcomes for this commissioning, or were they just commissioning to see what happened? And if I could add on Simon Tucker's point, Simon is saying the results from Plymouth look very much like KPIs. Can you elaborate on the difference?
Indeed. So there are certain things that Plymouth had to keep measuring because central government departments told them that they had to. So the thing that they changed was that they didn't put any of those performance measures into the contract. So they're using those measures as indicators for learning. They're not for performance measures. So they're still collecting that data, but they're using it to reflect on jointly. They're not punishing or rewarding anyone on a contractual basis for that. So none of those indicators are in the contracts. They still had to measure a bunch of those things for the central government departments that they reported to. And again, I would, in a really kind of daftly quick run through all of this, it's really easy to miss a bunch of the nuances. But one of the things I would say that it's a message that easily gets lost is, so sometimes I hear people saying, oh, Toby says we don't have to measure stuff anymore. No. Measurement is really useful, really, really important, because it helps when it helps for learning. But if you want to use measurement for learning, you need to stop using it for accountability, because you can't use the same measures for learning as you can if you use them for accountability. Because as soon as you use measures for accountability, prove to me that this works, then people gain the figures and therefore become useless for learning.
Thank you. Now, from Ruth Bradley, we have a question. I'm in a local authority. She says, I'm in an LA. I thought she was in Los Angeles, but she's not. She's in a local authority in Scotland. And she says, it seems that this starts with commissioners and a citywide approach. Until they're ready, where else can we make a start or experiment, or how best to embolden commissioners? So, I mean, we are seeing very clearly here, I'm hearing a real block at a certain level that perhaps doesn't feel as accountable for outcomes in this regard. So,
I mean, I like the word embolden, even though I'm not sure it's actually a word. It is now, let's go for it. So, because this does require bravery. Again, no one should get the idea that this is easy. It does require bravery, particularly from people in leadership positions in public sector organisations. So the question, particularly for voluntary sector organisations, is how do you become allies? And how do you create a sense of collective bravery around this? Because if it's easy for brave individuals to get picked off and get squashed, what they need is a sense of collective bravery, that folks are all in this together. And so the other thing I would say about this is, like, to create this kind of change at a large scale, you do need commissioners or funders to behave differently. In the end, the money has to behave differently because performance management systems have to be different. It's exceptionally hard, I would say impossible, to do this at scale over time if the money doesn't behave differently. But that's not to say that particular managers and leaders can't make changes themselves, because everyone has a space that every manager is choosing to manage in a particular way. Right. So if you're a team leader, say, and what you have is space to choose to manage your team differently, experiment with that. Yeah. And how can you come together with other team leaders or other people to create the largest permission space you can to experiment with doing differently? That would be the kind of question I would ask.
Now, Danny Gilliland, forgive me if I've mispronounced your name there, says, I'm interested in what sense do we have as to the level of interest stroke engagement in this idea broadly across commissioning teams, because, you know, yeah, you might have an inspirational person that decides they want to do this, but what happens if there are blocks? But what is also seen as the biggest system block in shifting the paradigm? Is it the top? Is it the middle? What is it? Where is it?
So I would say that's likely to be different in different places. So what we, the enabling conditions that we're beginning to see of this in different places are, it needs some kind of senior leadership champion, because it needs some kind of permission space at a large, at a senior level to give space to experiment, to give resources to that experiment, because you've got to learn if you're going to do this well, and also to give cover to it when things go wrong, because they will, because things always go wrong in any given complex environment. So people will make mistakes, blah, 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 things work, and also there will be people who lose out from doing it this way, because organizations have got brilliant at playing the new public management game, and some of those will be upset about doing things differently and will complain. So you need senior leadership cover to field those and continue that sense of bravery. You need middle operational level managers who get this stuff, because they're the ones who are going to actually create the spaces that to turn contract management meetings into learning meetings, for example. To team leaders who run I don't know, teams of social workers, or teams of drug support workers, or who, on the basis of treating every encounter with everyone you serve as a learning opportunity. Like, that requires each and every person to buy into that idea. So it requires kind of that support at all levels, and yet the places to experiment are the places where you can get that kind of alignment of, and once a place gets one of those, right? Yeah, because the beautiful thing about this type of systems change, this kind of paradigm shift, comes from a beautiful set of ideas, comes from a systems thinker called Donella Meadows, sadly no longer with us. She says, when you're making this kind of paradigm shift, don't waste a single second trying to convince the skeptics. You can't talk people into paradigm shift, because the nature of a paradigm is that you ask different questions and you treat evidence differently. There's nothing that you can show that will convince a skeptic to move from one to the other. What you can do, so the process of paradigm shift is creating an alternative reality and building that. So basically, all the people who've been working in this way have built an alternative reality in their little bit of the world, and then they just invite people in, because the key thing about this that means that people want to join in, is it cheaper, as I was saying before, but the people involved are having much more fun. Like, all the workers are achieving their sense of purpose. Why did I go into this work? Are
outcomes better for service users? Because that's the one measure that perhaps you haven't mentioned there. And for me, that's absolutely vital. So
yes, they are. But the point is, you can't prove that, because no one can prove.
But surely a person's own opinion of whether they have had a better experience is evidence enough.
Absolutely. So the feedback from people at the sharp end of this, people being served, is absolutely crucial to all this as a learning tool. But the moment you try and transform that feedback from people from a learning thing for those services, how do we get better at what we do, into we're going to use your feedback to prove that we're better to these people, that stuff starts to be gamed.
Okay. It's so interesting. Here's a question from Greg Spencer that I think is critical. What are the implications of new public measurement for how our schools and our educational systems operate? And what could we consider doing to ensure that young people emerging from school systems are better attuned to the insights of new public measurement? So in other words, you know, can we get in kind of upstream and address some of the people that are going to be working in the system in the future to come at it differently?
I mean, so this is where, like, my colleagues in business schools, I think, are really important, because we're educating the managers of the future, and so, like, changing how management is taught, I think, is really, really significant. I mean, one of the I've got a whole bunch of friends who are teachers and head teachers and all that kind of stuff, and like, one of the areas it's really, really easy to see the awful effects of new public management is in the education system. So the routine gaming of league tables and other kind of tests by teachers and or other managers, it's just like, there are so many people who are just basically consistently lying to each other. Like, this is the start of the change for many people, right? When people realise that they're something in, so this was the start of the change for me, right? Something in my head went snap when a commissioning manager who worked with the charity I ran asked me to lie to him on his own forms, on his own outcome forms. Toby, I just need you to write this on this form so that you can have like, we'd had a 10-year partnership, or he wanted to continue giving me the resource to do this because he knew that our work was effective because he was in touch with the kids that we were supporting. Asked me to lie to him on his own forms, because that's the game the new public management creates. And something went snap in my head, it's that this paradigm shift starts with a sense of dissonance, with public managers feeling, hang on a minute, I can't make my life make sense anymore using this story about how management is supposed to work. And that's the opportunity for change, right?
Fantastic. It would be great to hear any reflections again, any questions here. But I was struck by what you said, Toby, about systems stewards. Is there an argument for changing the structures, the job titles, the incentives that kind of get people scrambling up public sector ladders?
I think that I would say about kind of system stewardship, we are just learning about a whole bunch of these concepts, and the whole system stewardship one is where it is an area particularly where we need to learn a lot more. But places like Liverpool are now starting to appoint system stewards. So I got a kind of email the other day saying, have you got a job description for a system steward? I was like, no, but okay, we can try and figure out what one might look like from the different things that people are doing. Similarly, I think that we'll know when we're winning when the job descriptions for managers, team leaders, whatever, are primarily focused on learning. Like, that's a really, really easy thing to change. Let's do that right now.
Could be doing that right now, but how easy would that be for organizations out there? You know, it sounds simple, but it's probably not that easy. Here's a question from Pegs Bailey. She's saying, I think this is a really helpful starting point when talking about KPIs and moving beyond them. If we can acknowledge that the numbers we already get are distorted, then perhaps we can support leaders to trial doing things differently. Okay. That sounds like a high-risk strategy for me in terms of many very large organizations. How do you protect yourself and do that kind of thing?
So like, one of my starting points for this was this kind of realizing this sense that so many people were just are forced every day to turn their jobs into a game. And the game is, let's produce good-looking data. And that kind of begins to jar with people. And so we one of the things we started at the business school, like, was one of the first things, we created a seminar series called Little Heresies in Public Policy. We kind of used it as a platform for anyone who had enough, and we just kind of gave people 45 minutes to say, I remember this one person did this amazing. She just told the story of her time at a local authority where she basically said, my job was lying up the hierarchy. Oh. And I was brilliant at it, and I got really well rewarded for lying up the hierarchy. But I'm not prepared to do it anymore. This is my story. Right? If you create and give people platforms like this and share and build a community around it, it becomes really hard to ignore. This is what I'm saying. This sense of collective bravery around this stuff is really important.
So recruitment's a big issue. Now, I want to welcome, please, into the discussion, if I may, Lynne Williams, who's Policy Coordinator with the Glasgow Council for Voluntary Services. Hi, Lynne. Before we get into a bit of conversation between the three of us, what's your response to what you've heard there? Powerful presentation.
Yeah, look at my notes. I think just a few things, just quickly. I think from a human perspective, when do we lose sight of people in all of this and people suffering? And I want to reflect just in what the third sector tells us at GCVS, and also I'm also an unpaid carer, so my own experience of these systems on a day-to-day basis is that we've lost sight of people. We've lost sight of what we're trying to do here in Scotland and across the board. We see the way that bureaucracy really destroys lives in some way. And I want to reflect back just quickly on a piece of research that was done about 6 years ago by Demos and Quarriers called The Ties That Bind. And it just resonates, Toby, with all you've said. And it was qualitative research looking at families and how they interacted with public services. And the quote from that was this: the best public services work with the grain of people's social relationships. And that research was, for me, was one of these seminal light bulb moments. I think that you're talking about, Toby, was that often the reality of people's interaction with public services was it made them worse. And if you speak to carers and people who deal with the DWP, with social care, they talk often about fear and disempowerment. So they feel that they're being almost disempowered in some ways. So people will disengage with those services because of that. So for me, we've kind of lost sight of the brilliant work that was done, for example, by the Christie Commission 10 years ago now, where we looked at prevention, where we looked at people and communities coming first, about services working better and creating better outcomes. So we've lost sight of that. Another point I want to make is about the role of charities in the third sector. And I think that charities themselves get caught up in this paradigm here that we're in just now. And some are playing the game, but others I think are still trying very much to change people's lives. I always talk about charities changing lives, and I think they do. And I think they do create positive outcomes for people, regardless even of the environment they work in. So to give you an example of that, there's a carer centre in Glasgow who supports unpaid carers. And in a previous job, we were sitting with carers and a government minister, talking about what difference that charity had made to people's lives and how it had changed them. And I always remember a lady speaking and saying that if she hadn't spoken to the carer centre, she would have committed suicide. And here's the reason why. So I kind of want to maybe go back to Toby a bit and say, I think that organisations can facilitate good outcomes, and often regardless of the environment they work in. And that goes back to the point about the Demos Quarriers research, and also your point, Toby, about responding to complexity, is that when charities work really well, they respond to that complexity in people's lives, and they work with the whole family or the whole person and help that person navigate through, these complex systems. And then lastly, really, I think we're at a tipping point here. We've learned a lot during the pandemic. We know that the systems were broken before the pandemic, and the pandemic has just really thrown that into sharp relief. We saw some examples of bureaucracy being removed, of more collaboration between the public sector and the third sector, and maybe slightly less risk aversion. There's a whole industry going on around recovery just now and how we recover from the pandemic. But we will never recover from the pandemic unless we acknowledge where we were beforehand. And I'm not seeing that yet, I don't think. And lastly, I think unless we really have the voices of families at the hard end of all of this, shaping this recovery, of shaping how these services develop, then we're never going to get anywhere. And again, we're not quite there. But in saying that, to finish on a hopeful note, I do remain hopeful to a certain extent that we can learn. And it's great to see some people, colleagues from public sector in Scotland, saying we are open to these ways of working, and that's fantastic. So if we don't learn from the pandemic, we don't pick up these chances now, then we fail everybody. So fingers crossed that we don't go back to the way things were and we do build forward better.
Thank you very much, Lynne. Toby, if I could, ask you, right, so we've got charities and organisations doing it on the ground despite the best efforts of people up the chain. If it has to change from a leadership perspective in Scotland, because we're relatively small, that probably has to be a message from the First Minister or the relevant ministers to say, we expect this now. How would you persuade them to actually articulate that politically and make the system do it? Or is that the wrong language anyway? But you know what I mean.
Yeah. So I think the reason for my secondment to the Centre for Public Impact from Newcastle Business School is to begin to explore what the human learning systems approach looks like at a national government level. Because we know this stuff has emerged out of the local governance scale, local authorities, local voluntary sector, local NHS. So we know, and we know a reasonable amount about what this as an alternative approach looks like at that local scale. What we don't know is, what does that mean for a national government scale? So what's the role of national government bodies of all sorts in enabling this kind of practice? And so the joy of my secondment to CPI is I get to be, the question I'm asking is, which bits of which national governments around the world want to explore this? And one of the really kind of positive things is that there are bits of the Scottish government who are seeking to explore this. So there are some fantastic people in Healthcare Improvement Scotland, for example, who are seeking to ask some of these questions. We've begun to have conversations with different bits of the Scottish government. So I think the context for exploring this in Scotland is reasonably good. And if you were to ask me why, I think it's because compared to England, for example, the distance between central government and citizens is relatively small. And that means that the conversations about the stories of the lives of real people are actually capable of being listened to and heard by folks in central government, and that is not always the case in other parts.
That's a fantastic note to end on, actually, that there is an open door that in Scotland we can push against. Very, very briefly, because literally we've got 1 minute left. Would you suggest that organisations ought to come together to do that, or can you do it on your own?
So the more people come together, the more effective it is. I mean, simply. But the other thing I would say about this is, let's try and move away from a blame mentality in all of this. Let's treat everyone as fully rounded human beings and assume that they turn up at work every day to try and do a good job.
There would be an extra question there if we weren't running out of time, which is, what do you do if they don't? But never mind, let's leave that one hanging in the air. Thank you so much, Professor Toby Lowe. I'm very keen that we finish dead on time so that people can leave the call when they expected to. But that was really fantastic, and actually is potentially a really great scene setter for our next OWR Big Ideas, which is on Thursday, December the 3rd at 2 p.m. Leslie Thompson of the Scottish Government will be speaking about the National Performance Framework, which has been critically discussed all the way through these talks. That sets a scene. And just to remind you that we have another Our World Reimagined event on December the 9th with Anna Coote from the New Economics Foundation. Lynne, there's a conference next week. You've got less than a minute. Can you tell us a bit about it?
Yep, it actually fits in really well with this. So next week, GCVS and EFOC are hosting a joint conference, People, Places, Possibilities, where we'll look at all the sort of issues we've looked at today and more. There's some of the key thinkers across Scotland, public services, you know, third sector, recovery from COVID, all of this. Really, really cheap, £15 online GCVS event, right? Go for it.
Thank you so much. That was an incredible speed sell. So just to say thank you so much to all the participants that joined in this conversation, to thank you very much, Toby Lowe, for another really inspirational session that will certainly have me thinking even more, and to Lynne Williams for giving the response for the third sector. Thank you, and we'll see you next time round. Bye-bye.
Cheers, folks.